David has been on talk shows hosted across many networks, preferably Trinity Network as well. He holds a PhD in the philosophy of religion, and as widely known, he was instrumental in leading our friend we came to know in such a close way, Dr. Nabil Qureshi, to Christ through his close and compassionate friendship. This morning, it's such a joy to have him and to share what the Lord has shared in his heart this morning. As he reminded us yesterday, he'll be touching on his life story as well. Without much further ado, can we all put our hands together and warmly welcome good friend Dr. David Wood to speak to us this morning. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Check. Good morning. I'd like to begin by apologizing to the entire city of Houston for all the years that I've spent referring to Houston as the armpit of America, because every time I ever came here, it was hot and sweaty, and so people would say they're going to Houston, and I'd say, well, we'll have fun in the armpit of America, but turns out in December, it's really nice, so I take all of that back, and I will, from now on, I will refer to the state of New Jersey as the armpit of America, because every time I go there, it smells bad, and so we'll just switch that up. So I've been asked, hey, someone's water? I deal with jihadis. You think I'm scared of a water bottle? No, thank you. So I've been asked to share my testimony, and I actually don't like sharing my testimony. It's obviously a lot of embarrassing stuff, but that's not the reason I don't like sharing it. I embarrass myself habitually, so that's not a problem for me. And I always think there's something weird about churches that would have me share it on like a Sunday service, because I always think this is like R-rated. Like, don't you guys have any standards for what you share on a Sunday? That's kind of weird. No, but for years I would. If someone asked me to share my testimony, I would, but I wasn't putting it out there. I wasn't saying a lot about it publicly, apart from when someone would ask me. And the reason was that I became a Christian in jail, and then I spent the next several years as a Christian in prison. And so for the first several years that I was a Christian, every Christian I knew, every Christian I prayed with, every Christian I fellowshipped with was a murderer or a drug dealer or a robber or a rapist or something. So everyone came from a horrible, messed up background. Everyone had been a horrible person and done horrible things, and then eventually decided to follow Christ. So that was just normal to me. That's just what Christians were. That's everyone I knew. And then eventually I got out of prison, and I would meet Christians who had basically been serving God their entire lives. And I always thought that was amazing, right? That's what was amazing to me. Crime, that's just normal. People serving God their entire lives, that's what was really amazing to me. And so I would go to some church service where they were having some guest speaker, and the guest speaker would be saying something like, so back when I was in the mafia, here's all the stuff I did in the mafia. And I'd be sitting there thinking, boring. I know like 200 Christians who are way tougher than you, who did way worse things than you've done. So not interested. But what was amazing to me is that I was actually in a discipleship training group once. And we sort of went around the room, and we had to share a short testimony. And it got to these two brothers who were, I guess they were in their late 30s or so. And one of the brothers, when it got to him, said, well, I really don't have a testimony, because, I mean, I grew up and we had a really amazing Christian mother who was always praying with us. She wouldn't let us walk out the front door without stopping us to join hands with us and to pray. And we were always affected by that. And so me and my brother, we've just been serving God our entire lives. So I don't really have a testimony. And I'm thinking, you had an awesome mother like that, and you've been serving God your entire life, and you think you don't have a testimony? That's the amazing testimony, right? That's when things are working. And so anyway, that's what I was more interested in. So I just would much rather hear that than then a bunch of horror stories about people's lives before Christ. And so for years, I didn't say much until atheists started demanding that I explain my history as an atheist, because, people would point out that I'm a former atheist, and I would tell atheists, hey, I used to think like you, and then I believed in the gospel. And so atheists started saying, hey, we think you're making that stuff up. I don't think you really used to be an atheist. True atheists never change. Like half my Christian friends are former atheists, and they're saying, no, atheists don't change their minds. And so they kept bothering me for actually a couple years. Go on, tell us what kind of atheist you were, David. Tell us what a great atheist you were. And so finally I said, fine, I'll tell you what my life was like. And so here's what I told them. So I pointed out that, for my early years, I never believed in God, but it was never really an issue. It wasn't brought up as anything anyone needed to talk about. So I didn't really think much about God when I was young, and it was, I don't know exactly how old I was, but maybe 11 or 12 when I was thinking about God and really realized that I don't believe what other people believe. I don't actually believe in God. And it was a couple years after that when I officially confirmed myself as an atheist, and maybe a year or two after that I would tell people, I would tell my family and so on that I'm an atheist. I don't believe this stuff. But even though I was an atheist up until I was 20 years old, my path to Christ began when I was 5. I was 5 years old. Not a lot of people can say their life's path began at the ripe old age of 5. But when I was 5, I had this raggedy mutt named Goliath, and I was allowed to go outside by myself and walk through the woods if I had this little dog with me. And was a funny little critter. He would pretty much attack anything. He would attack cars, anything like that. One day I was walking through. I think other people in other areas of the country call them groundhogs. We call them woodchucks. But there was this giant woodchuck. It was like this big, and my dog was like this. And we were walking through the woods, and he got into this epic fight with this giant groundhog, and he tore that thing to shreds. This thing was just covered in blood. And so, but it was still alive. It was still alive and making this horrible squeaking sound. So I decided to sentence it to death by hanging. And so I took this groundhog and got a rope around its neck, and there was we were living at someone's house, and there was a deck out on back, and there were some stairs leading up to the deck. And so I dragged this groundhog up the deck and tied it off and pushed this thing over the edge, not realizing my mom had just come out underneath the deck to hang some clothes to dry. And so, yes, you can imagine her reaction as a giant bloody groundhog came flying at her through the air. And so anyway, this was my dog. This was what we would do in the woods, and ended up with all these fun situations with my dog. My mom hated the dog because we often got into situations like that. And one day, my mom got a phone call, and she turned to me with tears in her eyes and said that Goliath, my dog, had just been run over by a bus. And I looked at her and thought, so what, it's just a dog. Glad you all find that amusing. So I thought, so what, it's just a dog. And her eyes were tearing up, and I couldn't figure out, she hated my dog, right? Did you think the dog was going to live forever? Of course not, that would be silly. But you've got tears in your eyes, and you hated the dog, so I thought there was something wrong with my mom, right? Like what's wrong with this woman? Anyway, some time went by, and I saw other people who reacted the same way. We were living somewhere else about a year later, and there were 3 kids in the house, and their dog got run over, and they were all crying. And so it was like, it's spreading. Whatever this is, it's spreading. All these weird people who think that dogs live forever and don't realize, no, dogs die, and probably going to die really quick, and they are going to run out on the road if you let them out, and what's wrong with you stupid people? So I thought that everyone was having some very strange reactions to bad things that they should know were going to happen. But a little later, I started getting some amazing insights into reality that other people just couldn't see. They couldn't recognize them. But I was figuring them out as I got older and older. And the first one, I was at my grandfather's, and there was a lake a little behind his house, and I was sitting beside the lake by myself. No one else was around, and I was just staring at these fire ants marching in a line. And I was looking at them, and suddenly it just became crystal clear to me, like I'd been in the dark before, and suddenly a light came on. It suddenly became clear to me that ants actually ruled the world. And they had only tricked us human beings into thinking that we were in control. And can you imagine how brilliant these ants must be if they were not only controlling the world, they had also deceived all of us human beings into thinking that we were in charge? Do you have any idea how brilliant these creatures must be? And so that made perfect sense to me for a while. It didn't last for very long. That went away after a while. And it changed to other kinds of animals, mostly pets, later on. When I was young, as long as a dog was acting like a dog, or a cat was acting like a cat, eating food, staring off into space, as long as a cat or a dog were acting like cats and dogs, I had no problem. But when a cat or a dog would look me directly in the eyes, I would think that it was communicating with me and sending me a message that they're actually in charge, and they have been manipulating me all my life into doing what they want. And so if you caught me during this time, if someone had set up a video camera when no one else is around and I'm in the room with a cat or a dog, you could have seen me in there going, I'm on to you. I know who you are. I know what you're doing. You're not fooling me. And, I'm talking to a dumb dog. So that also didn't last for a while. That was on and off for a couple of years. By the time I was in high school, I was convinced that I had superpowers. I was convinced that I controlled the weather. And when some change would happen in the weather, I would think that I did it. And I would tell people that. They would think that I was joking. Something would happen, and I would say, yes, I made it stop raining so that we could do what we wanted. And they would think I'm joking. I was dead serious. I believed that I was controlling the weather. And along the way up through high school, I really got to think about my worldview and the implications. And what I concluded was that human beings are really deluded for thinking that we're so amazingly significant in this universe. I mean, if you think about the universe, you've got a universe, and it's like this. And our Milky Way galaxy is this tiny, tiny, tiny little speck in the universe. And our sun is an even more pathetic speck in that galaxy. And going around our sun is this ridiculous little piece of dust called Earth. And then on Earth, there are these little blobs of cells walking around thinking that what they do is so important. Now think about how delusional you'd have to be to think that what you do is so important. You little blob of cells that can't possibly change anything else that's going on in the universe. We're totally insignificant. And so as far as right and wrong are concerned, I concluded that the best thing we can do is just whatever you feel like doing at any given time, because there's no real point to any of this. And that made me kind of a pessimist. And so 10th grade or so, started doing pretty mean things just to do them. And Augustine, or St. Augustine as I'm calling him, but the philosopher Augustine, he in his Confessions, he had a story that started affecting him like this. He said there was a time when he and his friends stole a pear. And he pointed out we had money, we didn't need to steal the pear. We were just having fun one night and we stole a pear. And so he obsesses over stealing this pear, which we would think, so what, you stole the pear. But his point was we had absolutely no reason to steal the pear. We just did it because it was bad. We could have bought a pear. We had no problem. But we did it just to be bad. And so this caused Augustine to start wrestling with sin. I was doing certain things that caused me to reflect, but then I would just end up confirming what I already believe. So just to give you a kind of example here, I used to go to school, and I'd walk to school or ride my bike, and I would go up an odd trail and go down this deserted road because the road had been blocked off for years because it was too dangerous and was caving in at points. So I would go along that abandoned road, and then it was a shortcut to school. And one day, after it had snowed, I was heading to school, and I came across this woman in a car with her son who had tried driving down that road, not realizing she didn't see the sign that this road was closed off. And so she got to where it was blocked and tried to turn around, and her car fell down into a ditch. And so she's there in the snow in a ditch with her son. And I get there, and I say, "Don't worry, ma'am, I'll go get help." I didn't go get help. I just went to school and thought it was funny that this woman was sitting there waiting on me, because she might have gone and gotten help if I hadn't told her that I was going to go get help. And so, why are you guys smiling? I'm thinking, like, this is like so awful, right? Like awful stuff. I don't think she froze to death or anything, but my goodness, right? This woman sitting there waiting. Oh, when's this help coming that this generous young man went to get for me? Well, help wasn't coming. So this sort of went on for a while, and the summer after 11th grade, I had this awesome breakthrough. I was running from police in the middle of the night, and police had me surrounded on 3 sides. Right, so there was a road over here, and there were police cars on the road, and then there was a little hill and railroad tracks, and they were in front of me on the railroad tracks and behind me on the railroad tracks. So they had me surrounded on 3 sides, and the 4th side was the Monongahela River. And so police yelled stop, and I yelled no, and I dove into the Monongahela River, and I swam across the river, but I was smart, right? I knew if they would try to go around and be on the other side waiting for me, so I swam at an angle over the river, and I got there, and I assumed that they were going to be waiting for me on the other side, but I had outsmarted them. So I got there, and there's no one around me, and after working my way through the woods for a while, was going up a hill through trees and so on, and finally emerged from a patch of woods in someone's backyard. And in front of me was this huge, beautiful garden with all these lovely vegetables growing. And I needed to keep going in that direction because the police were behind me. So I started to walk around the garden, and then I stopped to philosophize. And I thought, why am I walking around this garden? I don't care about the people in that house. I certainly don't care about their vegetables. Why am I being so courteous here? And I couldn't think of any reason that I should be courteous about this person's vegetables. So as I stomped my way through that garden, I got this amazing rush of freedom. Like I had been courteous all my life in certain situations towards people's property or towards people, and that I'd finally realized that I don't have to do what people say. I don't have to do these kinds of things. And that can become kind of addictive, right? If that's what's giving you a good feeling, a feeling of freedom is doing the opposite of what you've been told all your life to do, you kind of have to keep doing that sort of thing. Now, I went over to my friend Jimmy's one day and was knocking on his door, trying to find him, and a military vehicle pulled up. His father was in the military, but a military vehicle pulled up, and a man came out dressed in military uniform, and he said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm looking for Jimmy." And he said, "Jimmy died." And Jimmy was one of my best friends growing up. He said, "Jimmy died." And he said that Jimmy had died parasailing. The whole time we were growing up, Jimmy always said that he wanted to go parasailing. He finally got a chance to go parasailing. His harness broke, and he plummeted to his death. And so this officer in the military told me this, and I started walking away. And I realized that I had the same reaction that I'd had when my dog died when I was 5. Namely, so what? He was gonna die anyway eventually. The only difference was, you guys are easily entertained with this stuff. It's usually kids too. You need to keep your eye on the young people. You can't trust them. So but I was walking away, and at this point, something was different. When animals or other people died when I was growing up, and I always thought that people were dumb for caring. At this point, I started thinking, it seems like I should be caring here. I mean, this was one of my best friends, and now we're never going to get to do anything together again. I should be bothered by this somehow. This should be some kind of concern to me, but it's not. I mean, I feel absolutely nothing. And so I started thinking that maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe there's a problem. Maybe I'm not wired right for some reason. So I had to work my way through that. But at the end of all of that, I concluded that I'm not defective. I have evolved to a higher stage of humanity. So other human beings, regular human beings, normal human beings 1.0, we're controlled by emotions. They're affected by things that happen to other people. But a new stage of humanity had come where we're not controlled by our emotions. We don't have those kinds of attachments. We can just operate by pure reason. Now, keep in mind, I'm a guy who used to think that I controlled the weather, right? And I think that my brain is somehow superior to everyone else's because I don't feel anything when bad things happen. But that's what I concluded. I concluded that I was the best, most advanced human being in the world. And obviously, I shouldn't be following the rules that the rest of you have to follow, right? How can you guys make the rules for me? That would be like an ape making the rules for human beings. Doesn't make sense, right? So that's how I thought, but I realized that following the same experience I'd had with the garden, where I stomped my way through the garden, if you really want to liberate yourself from the things that you've been taught, you kind of have to do the opposite of what you've been taught to get it out of your system. And a lot of things happened over the next year or two, but I eventually got put in a mental hospital after attacking my dad with a hammer. I wasn't mad at my dad. I just did it. He was the only relative I had within a couple hundred miles, and that was the most extreme thing I could think of doing. And I believed that this would somehow, as I did these things would somehow liberate me to higher and higher stages. And so I attacked my dad with a hammer. I left him for dead. Someone found him, took him to a hospital. The hospital said he will die here with his head injuries. So they took him to a different hospital where they had a world champion neurosurgeon, and I was put in a psychiatric hospital where they put me through a series of tests and concluded that I'm a sociopath. Now, I didn't at the time know what that was. I knew that my report said antisocial personality disorder. Didn't know what that was for years until I looked it up. But sociopaths don't form normal emotional attachments to other people. They feel no remorse. They can do anything. And things that would make other people feel bad, we can do them and we just don't feel bad. So it turned out that I wasn't some unique, perfectly unique human being, some new stage of humanity, some humanity 2.0. There are actually a significant number of other people out there. This is a known problem in the world. There are people who are defective in this way. But again, all it said was antisocial personality disorder. I didn't know until years later what that was. So I had no clue. I had no clue that I had some sort of problem at this point. Later, I was put in jail. And in jail, I came across a Christian in the same dorm with me. It was a Christian named Randy. Well, what's a Christian doing in jail? Sometimes Christians do stupid things and end up in jail, but that wasn't really Randy. Randy was a guy who turned himself in for 21 felonies. So Randy had done some things growing up, joined the Navy, became a Christian, and decided to go back and turn himself in for everything he'd done. So he went to police, said, here's everything I've ever done. They made a list of everything, and they said, okay, that adds up to 21 felonies. And so they put him in a dorm with me. And Randy was a pretty interesting fellow. I would try to talk to him sometimes because he's just by himself. And so, like one day there had been a fight, and I walked over to him and I said, hey, did you see that fight between Kevin and Corey? And he said, no. I turned away. I was praying that it would stop. Now that was strange. Fighting is the only entertainment we had in there. It was cards and fighting, right? And so this guy's like destroying half of our entertainment through his prayers. So that was extremely odd, but there was something interesting about the fellow. And, at the same time, I'm thinking, is this guy the stupidest person in the world? He got away with 21 felonies and then goes and turns himself in. He was long gone on a boat in the middle of the ocean. No one was catching him, and he goes and turns himself in. So you keep thinking, wow, this guy's really dumb. But at the same time, there's something interesting about people. He's different, let me put it that way. And one day he was up on his bunk reading his Bible. It was the first Christian I'd ever seen who sat around reading his Bible. And I walked up to him and I said, do you know why you're reading the Bible? You're reading the Bible because you were born in the United States. If you've been born anywhere else, you believe something else. If you've been born in China, you'd be a Buddhist. If you've been born in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you've been born in Saudi Arabia, you'd be a Muslim. Because people like you believe whatever you're taught to believe. Now that part about being born in India, meaning that you're a Hindu, must sound silly to many of you in this room. But I didn't recognize how silly it was when I was saying it. Namely, I'm accusing this Christian. By the way, almost any atheist you ever meet believes Christian people of various religions, are just dumb because they just believe what they're taught to believe. Whereas the atheists, they refer to themselves as free thinkers. We're free thinkers. Now, the reason that's silly is everything I believed about the universe and how it got here, life and how it got here, that was all stuff that I've been taught. And it never occurred to me to question those kinds of things. Never occurred to me to question what my biology teacher said about how life formed. Never occurred to me to question it. So here I am pointing a finger at the Christian. You just believe what you're taught to believe without examining it and studying it. And I believed everything I was taught to believe about the universe and life and so on. So, didn't recognize that, but Randy was the first Christian I ever met who would actually argue with me. Every other Christian I ever tried to talk to and would try to tell how silly it is to believe in God. I mean, if we understand everything through science, if we can explain the world through science, if we can explain life through science, why are you appealing to something else, to some sort of additional spiritual thing? Why would you do that? It's completely unnecessary, right? It's like if I say, hey, here's a watch. How does a watch work? Well, you've got all the components and you've got all those things, and there's a little ghost that lives in there too. Well, if I can explain how the watch works in terms of its parts, what do I need to appeal to a little ghost that lives in there? Similarly, if we can understand the world through science, why do we need to appeal to God? And so, before I was locked up, I would start arguing with Christians, and they would always, every single time, just back down. And it wasn't necessarily because they didn't know what they were talking about. They just didn't want to get into an argument. They didn't want to have a scene with, arguing with some atheists. So it would be, come on, I don't want to. This isn't the sort of thing that you would want to argue about. I'll pray for you, that sort of thing. Randy was a bit different, and it wasn't that he knew some exceptional amount of information. He knew the basics. He knew the basics of Christian apologetics. But he had this annoying habit of questioning me about things I would say. Met other people in life, and when I would say, oh, come on, all scientists agree that, and I would say something that I was making up. And people would just assume that I knew what I was talking about. And Randy would go, oh, really? All scientists? And, I knew I was making it up, but why is he asking me? Why is he calling me on that? Why is he calling my bluff, right? And so it would just be, I would be making claims, absurd claims, that were based on just something I'd heard years ago, never investigated it. And he would just say, really, why do you think that is? How did you conclude that? And it was forcing me to think about claims I was making, and I really didn't like it. And so Randy and I were hanging out every day. We were friends, but he was making me really mad. And so I would say mean things about him. I would tell everyone he's gay. I kept saying things like that. And I would look for weaknesses, things he cared about, so that I could attack them. I saw his sister. His sister came in to visit him one day, and I said some mean things, some very nasty things about his sister, until I actually got him to yell. And Randy yelled, and I go, look at you, yelling at me. You call yourself a Christian? And so anyway, that's how our lives were going on at that point. Eventually, Randy and I got into the world's first ever fasting battle. He wasn't trying to battle me. I was just trying to beat the Christian there. So Randy fasted for 7 days, nothing but water. And he told me that, eventually when he gets out, he won't have the opportunity to do long-term fasting because you don't want to, pass out on the job or something. So he was going to take this time in jail to do lots of long-term fasting. So he went 7 days on nothing but water. And I said, all right, going 10. First time I'd ever fasted in my life. I went 10 days straight, nothing but water, out of pure rage towards a Christian. Had to beat this Christian. I wasn't beating him at arguing, but I could beat him by sheer force of will. So I went 10 days, and then we kept going back and forth. He would fast for a certain number of days, and then I would always go 2 to 3 days longer than he did. And he eventually noticed this, and he said, how come every time I fast, you go 2 or 3 days longer than I do? It's just a coincidence, Randy. Eventually, Randy fasted for 40 days. He went 32 days on water, and then he started drinking Kool-Aid to prepare his body for food again. If you just eat a meal after 40 days of fasting, you're going to get messed up and maybe die. So he started preparing himself by drinking Kool-Aid, and then didn't eat until the 40 days were up. He told me that Jesus had done that Jesus has gone 40 days. I said, all right, going 42. And beat Randy and Jesus. So on the 11th day, they put me in an isolation cell. The administrators concluded that I was trying to starve myself to death. They knew that I had a mental health history, so they thought I was trying to starve myself to death. I'd finally lost it and was trying to kill myself. Now, keep in mind, I'm trying to beat the Christian. That's my goal in life, beat the Christian. They think I'm trying to kill myself. Like, that's the most creative way I could come up with to kill myself, is just starving myself to death. So they stick me back in this isolation cell where they have a camera pointed at me at all times so that, they can make sure I don't, bash my head against the bars or something like that. So it was back there that I realized, he's not smarter than I am. So there's no reason he should be prevailing in any of these arguments. The only reason he's winning in any of these discussions is that he's just studied these particular topics more than I have. I haven't studied these topics. I haven't studied the Bible. I haven't studied Jesus. So I don't know these things. That's why he's got an advantage over me. So while I'm back here in this cell, I will study Christianity, study the Bible, study the arguments, and then go back, and I'll be in a better position to crush Randy and show him that he should agree with me. So I had a few apologetics books that Randy had given me, and I had a set of Bible studies that I got from the chaplain there. Hey, chaplain, I'm really interested in learning the Bible. Could you give me a bunch of Bible studies? So he gave me these Bible studies that were they had graded assignments. I would have to do the reading and then answer all these questions, write these essays, send them in. They would be graded by a ministry, and they would send them back to me. So here's an atheist doing these Bible studies in jail and getting straight A's, trying to learn as much as possible to beat the Christian. And as I was back there, three things started to bother me over time. And one was what I now know is called the design argument. I didn't know it was called that back then. I thought that I had invented it. But I was lying on my bunk one day, and I was looking at the bricks on the wall. I'm staring at these bricks, and I thought, if someone told me that those bricks went into that order by themselves, by some sort of natural process, I'd think it was the stupidest thing anyone had ever said. And yet, I believe that life formed on its own. The simplest life, the simplest imaginable life, is vastly, vastly more complicated than that wall, than the bricks on that wall, than the arrangement of bricks on that wall. Why would I never in a million years believe that the bricks went into that order, but I believe life went into a certain order on its own, and I believed it without questioning it. That didn't convince me to believe in God, but it made me start thinking that perhaps I'd taken a few things for granted that I should have investigated along the way. In other words, when a teacher said, life formed, weird stuff can happen if you've got chemicals mixing together and so on, and so that's how life formed, maybe I should have said, that is a pretty astounding claim to say that this sort of thing can form on its own by natural processes. I'm going to need to see some very good evidence for that before I just agree with you. That's what I should have said, but instead, my teacher is saying it, she knows more than I do, therefore I'll just go with what she says. So that started bothering me. And you may have noticed along the way, I actually had some contradictory moral positions that just did not go together, did not fit together, and I did not recognize it because people don't always examine their own beliefs to see if they're consistent with one another. On the one hand, I believe that everything is ultimately meaningless. We're these insignificant blobs of cells. Everything we do is ultimately pointless. The universe will eventually die a heat death. Everything we did is meaningless. On the other hand, I believe that I'm the most important human being in the world, and I'm the new stage of humanity, and humanity is progressing towards greater and higher states. Now think about this. What sense does it make to think that I am the most important, most significant, meaningless blob of cells that's totally pointless? Those things don't go together, right? You kind of have to pick one. If everything is really meaningless, then so am I. And if there's no standard, then guess what? This person is not really better than that person. On the other hand, if I am somehow better than other people, then there's some sort of standard out there, in which case it's not all really meaningless. And so something had to give there. And as I was thinking my way through this, I realized that there's a kind of dilemma on my hands. There's either some sort of moral standard, some sort of standard of what's good, or there isn't. If there's no standard of good and bad, right and wrong, beyond what we think about them, if there's no real standard of right and wrong, good and bad, then under no circumstances am I any better than anyone else, and what I believed about myself was simply false. The alternative was that there is a standard of good and bad, right and wrong, in which case, what are the odds that this guy in this jail cell is really at the top of that scale? And so was thinking about the things that I'd done, right? I'm a guy who smashed his own dad's head in with a hammer. My mom's boyfriend used to beat her, and I wouldn't help her. Not because I was scared, I just didn't feel like helping her. I was like, why should I? Who cares? Doesn't really matter in the long run. Thinking about the things that I'd done and the state that I was in. I mean, just so you know, I'm about 255 pounds now. When I was locked up, I was about 235 pounds. I got down to around 150 by fasting, just not eating. Got a horrible rash all over my body. I would stand up and fall over. That's what got me sent back to that little cell. Someone was watching. Someone told me about it later. They said, you got up and started walking across the dorm, and all of a sudden you looked like a snake standing on its tail. He started wobbling like this and then just went down. And that happened over and over and over again. For some reason, I never caught on that, hey, just get up really slowly. I would just, oh, something's happening. I will stand up and then fall over. And so just sitting there thinking, you know, I've done some things that would normally be regarded as some of the worst things you could possibly do. I'm sitting back here starving to death, even though they bring me food every day. I'm scratching myself bloody. What sense does it make to think that I'm the greatest human being who's ever lived? What is that based on? What sort of standard could there possibly be for me concluding that? And I couldn't come up with one. So, again, either there is some sort of moral standard, in which case I'm not it, I'm not at the top, or there isn't a moral standard, in which case I'm still not at the top because there is no top. So under no circumstances was I the greatest human being in the world. And much of what I'd done had been based on the idea that I don't have to listen to other people because I'm better than everyone else. So that all started breaking down. And the other thing that was happening was I'd been studying the resurrection. And I found out first through Randy and then through reading how Jesus' apostles died. And the reason that was significant was that I'd always thought that I had an explanation for the origin of Christianity that made perfect sense to me because I didn't know much. It's easy to make sense if you don't know what the facts are, right? It's easy to make sense of some silly view if you don't actually know what the facts are. So I believed, whenever I heard about Christianity, that Jesus was a religious leader. He had some followers. Those followers really loved him, believed in him, and then he died. And they wanted to keep the movement going. So in order to keep the movement going, to keep the movement alive, they made up a story about him rising from the dead. And it worked. If you look around the world, it worked. This did keep the movement alive, and now people all around the world believe in Jesus because they hatched that initial plan. And that made perfect sense to me. That explained the origin of Christianity. The problem was I didn't have all the facts. And then I found out the facts, namely about how the apostles died. And almost all of them went to horrible, bloody deaths, proclaiming that Jesus had appeared to them, risen from the dead. Now, as a rule, liars make poor martyrs. If you're lying about something, if you're making something up, probably not going to be willing to die for it. And I sat there and tried to think of one person in all of history who made something up and then willingly died for what he knew that he'd made up. And I couldn't think of a single person in history, not one. What are the odds that of all the people in history who are willing to die for something they made up, Jesus just happened to have all of them, and there are none anywhere else? As a rule, if people are willing to lay their lives down for something, they have to believe it. Doesn't make what they believe true, but it means they really believe it. When a jihadi flies a plane into a building, this doesn't tell us that what he believes is true, but it tells us that he really believes it. He's not lying when he says he really believes this stuff. So, why would we believe what the apostles said when we know that people die for things that aren't true? Well, in most cases, when someone dies for something, when a Christian today dies for what he believes in, or a Muslim today dies for what he believes in, people are dying for a message that they heard from someone else, that they believed it. And they often believe with such confidence that they're willing to endure danger or even death. So if we ask, how did this jihadi become so confident that he's willing to lay down his life? Well, he heard a message from someone else, and it was persuasive to him, and so he believed it with such confidence that he was ready to die for it. That doesn't tell me that what he believed is true. That tells me that he's really confident in a message that he heard. Notice the disciples are in a completely different category. They're not dying for some message about Jesus that they heard preached to them and that they believed with such confidence that they were willing to die. The apostles were dying for something they saw. They said that they had seen a man risen from the dead. He appeared to them after death. And so they're not dying for some message that they heard, that I could dismiss the message and I could say, well, it's a false message, the person believed it and he was willing to die for it. They weren't dying for some message that they heard. They were dying for something that they saw. So in this case, it's different. We have to ask, what did these men see with their eyes that convinced them that Jesus, who was dead, appeared to them alive again? What did they all see? Notice, there's no good explanation here apart from something like the resurrection. People try, they'll say, maybe it was hallucinations. Well, a hallucination is just something in your mind. If you're seeing a hallucination, the person beside you is not seeing the same hallucination because it's by definition, it's only in your mind. So for all of these witnesses, and there were more than 500 of them, to see hallucinations, all see the same hallucination, that would be beyond ridiculous. So what could have convinced all of these witnesses, not just that Jesus had risen from the dead and appeared to them, but gave them such confidence that even after decades of being able to rethink their views and to think, did I really see him? Was that really Jesus? Decades later, torture and even sentences of death, their faith was never shaken. And so what could have given them that level of confidence? And there, I couldn't help but think that the only thing that could have given them that level of confidence was that they actually saw Jesus. And if they actually saw Jesus, then it looks like we've got a miracle on our hands. And if we've got a miracle on our hands, then if anyone in history has God's stamp of approval, it's that guy. And so if we're going to listen to anyone in history, tell us what the world is really like. Tell us what the afterlife is really like. Tell us about God. I'm going with the guy who has God's stamp of approval because I'm not going to think that God just raised some weird random heretic from the dead. If anyone has God's stamp of approval, it's him. And so we look at what Jesus' message is. It's a message about the kingdom of God and what he was doing to give us his righteousness. And so, thinking through these things for a while, I wasn't completely convinced, but I started thinking, what have I got to lose here? If I pray and it turns out to be wrong, how did I just hurt myself? I mean, look at me. Can't even stand up without falling over. What if I pray and it turns out to be false? It's not like, now I'm really bad off. So, was sitting there, and I bowed down, and I prayed. And I said, God, I don't know if I'm going to believe in you tomorrow, but I believe in you right now. And if you can do anything with me, you're welcome to it. And so I said a prayer that I read from one of those Bible studies. And when I sat up from that prayer, the whole world looked different. It was like everything was a different color. The walls looked different. The bars looked different. Everything looked completely different. And don't base your confidence in Christ on feelings. Feelings can lead you astray. But if I were to describe the feeling I had, I felt like that I had been fighting. I mean, physically brawling non-stop for my entire life, and that I finally had a chance to just stop and sit down and rest. And so I thought, well, that's a nice change. And didn't know much at this time, kept reading the Bible. And so I became a Christian, but notice, I was 20 years old, and as far as I could tell, my entire life was ruined. I was already a convicted violent felon. I had years left to serve in prison. The psychiatrist there was trying to have me sent to Miriam, which would have been my third mental hospital, because, again, they were thinking that I'd finally snapped. Doctor was threatening to tube feed me, and I was a Christian. So I was right with God, and I had peace, but what else is there, right? I've already ruined my life. And there's just one problem with that thinking. I now believed in a God who raised Jesus from the dead. And that sort of starts a process of what we might call resurrection thinking. Resurrection thinking should be not only the heart of apologetics, but the heart of the Christian life. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the worst thing that could possibly happen happened. The worst thing that could happen happened. If I were to ask someone today, what's the worst thing that could happen? It might be, my child dying or something like that. There are actually worse things that can happen. Namely, the creator of the universe, who sustains us for every moment of our existence, entering the world and putting himself at the mercy of sinful creatures to torture and kill him. And if he happens to be the Messiah as well, the one who's supposed to bring peace to the world, and he dies, well, now there goes our hope as well. So that's the worst thing that could happen. And yet, 3 days later, Jesus rises, and we find out that the worst thing that could possibly happen was actually the greatest thing that could ever happen. What was the worst thing that could ever happen actually turned out to be the thing that reconciles God and sinful human beings. And so it was the greatest thing that ever happened. And that had a massive impact on the early Christians. You take someone like the Apostle Paul. Paul persecuted the church. And when he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, keep in mind, as far from Paul's perspective, when he hits the ground and Jesus says, I'm the one you've been persecuting, he's convinced that Jesus is there for judgment, right? You've been persecuting the church, and now it's over. I'm here to destroy you. That's what Paul would be thinking on the ground. But Jesus doesn't say, you've been persecuting me, and now I have to destroy you. He says, get up. Paul's life was not over. Paul's life was just getting started. And he was impacted by that kind of thing and by the resurrection. So much so that even years later, it didn't matter what happened to him. This was a guy who was, he received the 39 lashes 5 different times. He was beaten with rods 3 times. He was shipwrecked multiple times. They tried to stone him to death. He survived. Every sort of abuse you could heap on someone, this guy had it. And yet, he could say, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. This guy's like the apostle of the bright side. You can walk up to Paul and punch him in the face and, I'm still standing. Hit him even harder. He hits the ground. Still conscious. Stomp on him. Knock him out. He wakes up later. Still alive. And if you kill me, I get to go be with Jesus, right? You can't keep a guy like this down. He'd been influenced by the message of the resurrection. And that's been impacting Christians for 2,000 years. So that eventually, just to tie it in since you guys know Nabil, after I got out and then end up sharing a hotel room with Nabil, and he starts telling me why Islam is true. Nabil and I spent 4 years discussing these things. And there were Christians telling me during this time, why are you spending so much time talking to this one guy? He's obviously hard-hearted. He's not listening. You could be witnessing to so many more people now. You could be talking to so many atheists and showing them the truth. Why are you spending year after year talking to the same person? Well, I happen to know someone, myself, namely, who really you would have said the same thing about. This is hopeless. This is a hopeless, hopeless situation. And so I can't rule Nabil out just because he's resisting year after year after year. Can't just leave him behind like that and assume that he's too bad, right? He's just too stubborn. So it took years, and my reasoning was, if this guy keeps coming back as we're having these discussions, I just believe that God is drawing him. And so, like you, I got to watch Nabil's ministry over the years, and I mean, he was only here as a Christian for 12 years, put out multiple books, got multiple degrees, preached around the world, and just to tie it in here with Houston, a few months back, I wanted to make sure that my wife saw Nabil when he was in the hospital because I didn't know how long he would have. And my wife and Nabil and I were friends in college. And I actually met my wife when Nabil and I were arguing. Nabil and I were arguing about the resurrection of all things. We're arguing about the resurrection, and this young lady comes up and says, "You're both right." And Nabil and I were very puzzled by this. Say, wait a minute, I'm saying he rose from the dead. He's saying he didn't rise from the dead. Those are the only two possibilities here. One of us has to be right, the other has to be wrong. Under no circumstances are we both right. Now, she was an agnostic, but she was a nice agnostic, right? A mean agnostic is like, none of you have any clue what you're talking about, everyone's wrong. Whereas a nice agnostic is more, you're all right, because, you know, whatever makes you happy is true for you in that sense. So she said that, both Nabil and I turned on her, and about 2 weeks later, she was a Christian. Because I knew I wanted to marry her, so I put all my apologetics efforts. And that's a message for you young people. Apologetics can help you get girls or get a... And so she became a Christian. It was cool because then we were all friends, and that was 2-on-1 with Nabil. And so anyway, just a few months ago, sent my wife down here, and we have two fully disabled children. We have 4 sons. 2 of them have a genetic muscle disease. Their muscles don't work. And so my wife headed down. She got on the plane, and right after she left on the plane, we have a night nurse, and she came in and said, I think Paley's leg is broken. Paley's our youngest. She said, I think his leg is broken. And I thought, what? That's ridiculous. There's no way his leg is broken. And so I didn't even pay much attention, and eventually later that morning, I started touching his leg, and he started crying. And so I was wondering what's going on here. Called an ambulance. They came in there, and they said, there's no way his leg is broken. He would be losing his mind right now. But when we tried to move him, right where his femur's connected, it just flopped over. So his leg was broken. Didn't find out till later in the hospital that because his muscles don't work, he doesn't stand on his legs. His bones didn't form as strong as they should have. So his femur bone looked like a pencil. And so just by lifting him up, his leg had broken when the nurse was trying to lift him up. And so I'm there with him in the hospital. Keep in mind, I have another disabled son at home, so I'm trying to go back and forth, which would be a really good time to have my wife there. And she's on a plane when I'm finding all of this out. She lands, and part of me wanted to say, get back here. But I said, no, you're down there. You have to see Nabil. We don't know how long he has. Now, this is right when Hurricane Harvey is coming right for you. And so I'm there. There's a hurricane heading directly for you. I'm racing back and forth. I would have to take care of one son while the other one is at the hospital. And then as soon as the night nurse got there, I would have to rush to the hospital to take care of the other son. And my wife's gone. And Nabil is asking to go home because he really wanted to go home from the hospital. A hurricane is coming. Don't know if my wife's going to be able to get out of there before the hurricane hits, in which case everything's closed down. And I was talking to her on the phone, and she said, you're handling this really well. And she said that because I tend to freak out over lots of little things, right? I mean, I will lose my pen, and hey, what happened to my pen? I just had it. I didn't go anywhere. I set it down, and now it's gone. Who stole my pen? Who's conspiring against me I will get mad over something like that. So I told her, I said, I'm really good with the big things that go wrong. It's the little things that bother me, because when a little thing happens, I can't imagine that there's some real, point to it. I lost my pen, but now there's peace in the Middle East, so it's all taken care of. But when everything that can possibly go wrong, injured children, me racing around, not getting any sleep, wife going to be stuck in Houston from a hurricane, Nabil, as you know, was taken home, and then they had to evacuate him out of there. Everything going wrong. Then there's a kind of calm, because I'm always thinking, I bet God is glorified out of all of this. I bet everything that's going on right now Because if God raises Jesus from the dead, and that was the worst thing that could happen, and when things are going really, really horribly, I can't help but think that this is all going to turn out for God's glory. And so that includes everything. Nabil's death. Tragic, because if you're watching Nabil's trajectory, you're thinking if he did all that in 12 years, what's he going to do with 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years? But at the same time, as someone who believes in a God who raises the dead, I have to believe that God can raise up new Nabils. And I believe we're going to see many, many new Nabils rising up, studying the work of Nabil, being influenced by the work of Nabil, seeing the testimony to the end of Nabil. I believe we're going to see many, many people like Nabil rise up and preach the gospel around the world. And if I really, really think about it, and I think about the situation we're in, I look, and for 14 centuries, it was very difficult to reach people like Nabil with the gospel because you'd have to go to a Muslim land, and there you're going to get your head chopped off. Whereas now, people like Nabil are coming to the United States, where Christians have the opportunity to share the gospel. Muslims around the world, we can now reach. We can now reach with the gospel wherever they are, using technology, using our videos, using our smartphones. We have all of this ability to reach Muslims with the gospel and reach others with the gospel. And so I believe, even when everything is going horribly wrong, I believe that we are going to see more Muslims come to Christ in our lifetimes than all other generations before us combined. I believe we're going to see more Hindus come to Christ in our lifetimes than all other generations combined. Just looking at the signs of the times and looking what's been given into our hands. And when we look, there's so much to be depressed about, so many bad things going on. But when we look at the signs of the times and we see that out of all the generations of Christians who have ever lived, 2,000 years of Christians, we're the ones who suddenly have the opportunity to bring the gospel to every group in every nation instantly, as soon as we want to do it. So we are people who are going to have to stand before God one day. And we don't want to stand before God and say, you gave us the greatest missionary opportunity in the history of the church. But we were too focused on things of this life, or we were too scared that people might say something mean or think that we're intolerant, that we didn't take advantage of it. We don't want to stand before God like that. We want to stand before God and say, thank you, God, for giving us this unprecedented opportunity to share the gospel with every group, every nation, make disciples of all nations, baptizing Muslims, Hindus, atheists, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we want to hear, well done, good and faithful servants.
What an amazing testimony that we have heard just now. Let us thank God for this man of God. Praise God. Amen. 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 Dr. David, we really appreciate you coming and ministering among us yesterday and today. We've been thoroughly blessed, and we are sure that we will continue to pray for you and your ministry. May the Lord send you to different nations of the world to touch many lives. May the Lord use you. And thank you all so very much for being here this morning. Let us look to the Lord in prayer.